Good evening. If you want to open your Bibles to Exodus chapter 19, that's where we'll be. That's where we'll start this evening. Once again, very good evening to everybody. Glad to have you with us. And the auditorium class here, we're going to be continuing our study in the book of Exodus that Joe Wilson started the last quarter and took us up to chapter 20 the last time. But we've kind of been inconsistent in the last few weeks, and so I want to back up and just kind of get everything in order as far as where we are in the book, and then we'll continue forward because there's actually some divisions that we can use, some chapter divisions and things like that, and book divisions that will help us in understanding. Sounds like you got some music playing or something in there. If he wants to check that. All right. So, let's just do a quick test, if you don't mind. What is the book of Exodus about, just in general? Getting out. Getting out. There you go. That's a good summary. It's about exiting, Exodus. That's actually what the word means. So what are we getting out of? What's the Exodus about? About bondage? Getting out of bondage. What are we referring to there? Say again? Egyptian bondage. All right. And what else do we read? Who's the main characters in the book of Exodus? Moses. Who else? Aaron. Can you name some more characters? Pharaoh. He's a major character. That's right. Miriam. Very good. Okay. So one of the things that always helps me in my study of the Bible is how to divide the book. In other words, where am I in the story? It is no different than you would do with watching a movie or anything else. Movies and stories have different sections that you move through. And a lot of the Bible books have easy divisions, some of them not so easy. So the very first part of the book of Exodus is exactly what you were talking about. It has to do with slavery. Chapters 1 through 6, we read the story of basically Egyptian bondage. Israel is under the rule of the Egyptians. They are slaves to the Egyptians. You have the story of Moses. And so you have the birth of Moses and then the call of Moses. And then beginning in chapter 7 up until chapter 18, we have what I like to call the salvation section. So you have the slavery section, chapters 1 through 6. And then the salvation section beginning in chapter 7 through 18. And what I mean by that is that's when Moses then goes to Pharaoh. You have the 10 plagues. You have them being led out of Egypt. You have crossing the Red Sea, the journey to Sinai. And then you get into the third and final section. So basically what I'm saying is that one of the ways I like to divide the book, and that you will see sometimes in various outlines, is in 3 sections, chapters 1 through 6, chapter 7 through 18, and then chapter 19 through 40, and this last section is sanctification. And so it's just an easy way of remembering, SSS. And so you have slavery, first 6 chapters, and then salvation, and then sanctification. Now what do we mean by that? Well, they've been taken out of the land of Egypt, and now God has brought them that's where we pick up in chapter 19. That's why this is an entire new section, because from this point forward, 19 to 40 is this sanctification. And basically God, does anybody know what sanctification means? To set apart. God is setting them apart, and sanctifying them by giving them this law. And so that's where we pick up in chapter 19. And I think it's important to backtrack on this so that we can look at the 10 Commandments again briefly. Joe already went over those, but I want to go over, just add a few more things to that before we move into the next chapter, which will be chapter 21. So beginning in chapter 19, verse 1, in the 3rd month, after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on the same day they came to the wilderness of Sinai. And so this shows us where we are in the story, that the children of Israel making this journey. And then we have a lot of interesting events that happen in this chapter that sets up the context for God giving them the law. And so if you look, beginning in verse 3, and Moses went up to God, and God called him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, Tell the children of Israel, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and now how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, right here, verse 5 and verse 6 is basically the main context of where we are in the story and what the Ten Commandments and the rest of the precepts are couched in, if you will. And that is, now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. So this is why God brought them out. He brings them to Mount Sinai. He has now gotten Israel out of Egypt. And from this point forward, he is now going to try to get Egypt out of Israel. And so that's why he's saying, and you're going to see this phrase over and over and over for the next 1,000 years or so. If you will heed my voice, you will be my people. And even today, the same precept applies to us. If you will heed my voice, you will be my people. Now, Jesus said that in John chapter 14, verse 15. If you love me, you'll keep my commandments. Paul, you had something to say? Yes. No, I don't know. I don't know.
As Christians, we're the kingdom of God.
Yes.
We're all priests. Christian priests in the kingdom of God.
That's right.
Right there in verse 6, God says, you, Israelites, will be my kingdom of priests. Now, they had priests. They had a high priest, specifically. But just like we're all priests, yet we have elders. They're a step up from us in authority. So I'm wondering, am I reading too much into it here when he's calling them a kingdom of priests? Is it all of them, in a sense?
Okay.
In a sense, like we are priests, or am I reading too much?
Okay. So the question is, am I reading too much in there about looking at the kingdom of priests in here? There are several things that go on. First of all, you're using 2019 Christian glasses to read the Bible. And so what happens is, this is part prophecy. It is part prophecy in the fact that exactly what Peter says in 1 Peter 2, verse 9, but you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into the marvelous light. You can apply all of that to what he said to Israel, who called you out of Egypt into this land of Sinai. So it has a prophetic sense to it, but it also has an immediate fulfillment that's going to happen. And you see that over and over and over in the Old Testament, that there's going to be an immediate fulfillment, but also a time prophetic statement that's part of that. Does that make sense? So I don't think you're reading too much into it. I think you're seeing it with what I would consider Paul's eyes. That's how Paul would probably interpret the passage if he was preaching it. All right? So I put a box around those two verses. If you will indeed heed my voice, obey my voice, keep my covenant, you shall be my special treasure to me above all people. That's the context of all the laws that he's about to give. So you begin in chapter 19, and for the next 21 chapters, he's going to give laws. He's going to give precepts. He's going to give commandments, things that we have to do or that the Israelites have to do. And this is what it all boils down to, this right here. So Moses came, verse 7, and called for the elders of the people and laid before them all these words which the Lord commanded him. And this next verse is one of the beautiful verses of the Bible. Every time I read these words, and you will see them from time to time, then all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Aren't those beautiful words? That should encourage us, should warm our hearts whenever we see that. And we see that in several different times throughout the Old Testament story, the Old Testament history of God's people coming to realize that He is God and we must do what He says. And this is that first time. So they said they're going to do it. Now I want you to notice some things that start happening. So in the rest of this, Joe really covered most of this chapter, so I'm not going to read all the verses. I'm just going to skip down a little bit. And one of the main things that you see is verse 14. Then Moses went down from the mountain to the people and sanctified the people, and they washed their clothes. This is a key thing. That's why we're talking about sanctification. That's why I give that name to this section of these chapters, is the setting them apart, and the symbolism that even goes along with washing your clothes. So he says to the people, get ready. And then I love verse 16 through 18. Then it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunderings and lightnings and thick cloud on the mountain, and the sound of the trumpet was very loud, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Now I want you to transport yourself back to this time frame and imagine yourself in the middle of the desert at the foot of this mountain, and this, verse 18, is what you see. Now Mount Sinai was completely in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. How would you feel? I don't know if you've ever been in an earthquake, near a volcano, or even something, the closest thing I can relate to that, other than a storm, but something of nature, is when we saw Iguazu Falls, those huge waterfalls, and you could get as close as from here to that wall to the falls from a platform that went out there, and you could just feel the power of that massive wall of water coming over. And I thought, this is just an inkling of the power of God. Can you imagine sitting at the foot of a mountain and the thing is shaking and there's fire and there's smoke going up? That's enough to strike fear in anybody's heart, don't you think? And that's going to come into play in just a little bit. And so, as we read through this, and we see that he even says in verse 22 to sanctify the priests. So there is, during this time, he's going to establish not only these laws of what you're supposed to do, but he's also going to establish the religious system, the theocracy that is going to be the ruling form of Israel. And so that's all going to come about. In fact, there are 4 sections of precepts that you can find in what's the law of Moses. And it starts right here in chapter 20. And you also see in the book of Leviticus, that's a whole other collection of precepts. Then in the beginning of Numbers, another collection of precepts. And then a repetition of that along with some clarification in Deuteronomy. And so here, he's getting ready to give them these laws. That's the context. And that's when we go into chapter 20, the chapter that has the 10 commandments. So what we have is on Mount Sinai, God gave to his special people a special law that would take them into a special land to fulfill a special purpose of bringing forth a special person, the Messiah. It all has a plan. It's all part of God's plan. And so we need to recognize that as we begin to read these laws and put forth that it's more than just thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that. It's a lot more than that. He's trying to, we know that from reading the book of Romans and Hebrews, that the law helps us to understand what sin is. It helps us to understand what God doesn't like and what God does like. And that's why it's important to understand what's happening here. Not just read, thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that. So then we get into the 10 Commandments. All right, and so you have And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Now, it's interesting. I don't know if you have sat down and looked at these, and, we call it the Ten Commandments. And there's a reason for that, because there are verses that say, literally, the Ten Commandments. It's also called the 10 Words. As you look through this, have you ever enumerated them to find, so where are these 10? So if you look, what would be the first law? If you're looking at this, reading these first few verses. So verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me. I mean, if you listen to the words, you shall have no other gods. That's a command, right? Well, it's interesting. The Jews, whenever they enumerated these, they enumerated verse 2 as that first commandment. And then they took verse 3 through 6, made that all one commandment. And then they divided, so that was verse 1. Verse 2 was the first commandment, verse 3 through 6, the second commandment, and that's how they got 10. And then, later on, it's interesting that the Roman Catholic Church, they made 3 through 6 the first law, and then took verse 17 and divided it so that they wound up with 10. Kind of interesting, a little historical thing that I discovered there, that the way they enumerate the 10 laws. But then, of course, as most of us and a lot of scholars and just from reading, we usually start with that first commandment being in verse 3. You shall have no other gods before me. That next one, the second law, second commandment. You shall not make for yourselves any carved image of any likeness of anything that is in heaven or above, or that is in earth beneath, and the water under the earth. Well, I have a question for you. I want to, if you will, turn over to Exodus chapter 25. Right here, just go over to chapter 25, verse 17. Uh-oh. It says here, you shall make a mercy seat of pure gold. 2.5 cubits shall be its length, and 1.5 cubits its width. And you shall make 2 cherubim of gold. Of hammered works you shall make them the 2 ends of the mercy seat. Make 1 cherub at one end and 1 cherub at the other. And you shall make the cherubim of the 2 ends of one piece with the mercy seat. They shall stretch out their wings, covering the mercy seat with their wings, and they shall face one another. The faces of the cherubim shall be toward the mercy seat. Okay, let's back up now. Let's go back to the 10 Commandments. And commandment number 2 is, you shall not make for yourself any carved image. How do we get around this? Have you ever thought about that? That just a few chapters later, God gives them commandment to make a carved image. What's going on here? Yes. I see you're like,
the idea is a carved image to, number 1, represent God himself, and number 2, as an object of worship.
there you go. As an object of worship. Look in verse 5. Verse 5, he clarifies, you shall not bow down to them nor serve them. The cherubim were just ornaments, just like many parts of the tabernacle that are going to be fabricated, including, and when you get in later on into the Temple of Solomon, and they have these big, beautiful columns that they even have names for the columns, and things like that. These ornaments and different things that are used. It's no different than having a church building that just simply has some ornaments, some decorations, some nice things. I mean, we got patterns on our seats here. That's the difference. You're not bowing down to those things. I love Isaiah chapter 44 when he says you take that piece of wood and you build a fire and you start cooking your food, and then you take a piece of that wood and you carve out a little idol and set it up and go, here's the God that gave me this food. It goes, makes no sense. That's paraphrasing, of course. But there's a big difference between what's happening there as just decoration, just beauty in God's tabernacle, and bowing down to a carved thing. There you go.
He comes and tells me to do it. I
told them to make that.
That's right.
By the way, people couldn't, if you look at the history there, you couldn't, your eyes were not to look, even the priests didn't look at that. Even when they took it and carried it away, you will find that they did not look at that.
That's right.
They were not there. Even the high priest, there's question whether he looked at it when he was trimming and in the holy place. So, again, God ordered that one. Don't make yourself a carved image.
There you go. That's right. Good explanation. Yes. Yes. Yeah. He told them to do that. Yeah, but then they turned it into an idol later. You know, Dan Jenkins, preacher down at Palm Beach Lakes, I remember years ago asking him, as I was learning more about the faith myself, I asked him, I said, how can we trust the Bible that we have? And he said, well, we have, 5,000 manuscripts of the New Testament, and we have the Dead Sea Scrolls that date back before that. We know we can depend on what's written here as being the same thing that Jesus had, the same thing that the first century had. And I said, well, but they're copies. Where are the originals? How do you know that we have the copies are right? And he I don't remember what the answer was, but that night he preached a sermon. And I'll never forget that sermon because he says, I am glad that we don't have those original, the original letter that Paul wrote to the Romans. Because you know what we would do with it? We would worship it. And so I thought that was very wise, and it shows God's wisdom. So that's what we have. And notice this first thing of God is this duty to God, not having that. That the duty continues, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And then the fourth law, remember the Sabbath. And then the fifth law, honor your father and your mother. The sixth being, you shall not murder. The seventh, you shall not commit adultery. Eighth, you shall not steal. Ninth, you shall not bear false witness. And 10, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. Now, I found a chart that I really like that takes the 10 Commandments and breaks them down into what essentially boils down to duties. You have duties to God and duties to man. That's what the 10 Commandments are. And so if you think of the duties of God, the first one has to deal with God's sovereignty. It's a duty to God's sovereignty. Have no other gods. It's a duty to God's service with no graven images. The third one has to do with God's sanctity by protecting His name. The fourth one is God's Sabbath. A duty then, the fifth one, to God's servants, that it being honor the parents. And all of that falls under Matthew 22, verse 37, that says, you shall love the Lord God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's actually Mark 12, but it's talking about love God with all of that. That's the first commandment. Then the second one is do unto others as you, the second one is love your neighbor as yourself. Matthew 22, 38 to 39, that's duty to man, and that's what you see in the 10 Commandments. Number 6 is protection of man's life. Don't murder. Number 7, protection of man's mate. Don't commit adultery. That, by the way, that applies to both men and women. It's not just men. Number 8, man's property. Don't steal. Don't be a thief. Number 9, man's reputation. Don't have false witness. Give false witness. And then number 10, protection of man's heart. Don't covet. You know, if you really stop and think about it, and we've heard this before, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbors yourself. If you do those things, you will not do these things. If you love your neighbor, you're not going to steal from him. If you love your neighbor, you're not going to murder him. Or all those other things. And if you love God, you're not going to make a carved image. If you love God, you're not going to use His name in vain. Say again. Yes, you could. Because one of the things you'll hear preachers say sometimes is that we Christians today, let me just ask the question, see how many of you know the answer. Are we under the 10 Commandments, these 10 Commandments, today? Yes or no? No. Good. That's very good. Well, so Connie, what you're saying is it a type, an anti-type? Yes, we have the same thing that's brought over into Christianity, and you can identify that in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, verse 7. Remember what Jesus says in almost all of these. He says, you've heard it said, thou shalt not kill. There it is. There's the law. But I say, who has all authority, he takes it one step further. Talking about this physical law, and he's taking it even one step further into the heart. Don't even think about it. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery. Well, I say, don't even think about it. And it continues on. That makes sense? That answer your question? He brings over all 10 laws except one. Yeah, I should say he brings over 9 laws and not one, and that being the Sabbath. And that's a whole other study because of the first day of the week being the day that Christians worshiped and the day that Jesus arose from the dead and things like that. Yes?
So, if the Ten Commandments were uttered there today, so is it wrong to have the Ten Commandments in your home as a symbol?
No, I'm not. Number one, I'm not going to go there and say that it's wrong because it's still God's law, you know. And if you want to have that as a reminder, and I don't think it's a bad. This is opinion. I don't think it's a bad thing to have the 10 Commandments, but you get into a problem whenever it says, "Thou shalt keep the Sabbath."
Oh well, yeah.
Oh well. Oh well.
I mean, I know that they're not, but I just wondered if if I should take that down.
As long as it's not in the courthouse.
As long as it's not in the courthouse. So we have, the principles are still there, and Christians still do have the 9 of these 10 commandments. And really, you know, we could even say the 10 with the Sabbath if you want to take that into Sunday, but we don't have a command to guard the Sunday, not work and all that stuff, although that's a good practice and the principle is there, and it would behoove us to do it. So you have the 10 commandments that are given, and then there's this verse 18. Now all the people witnessing the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain of smoke, when the people saw it, they what? They trembled where they stood. And then they said to Moses, you speak with us, and we will hear, but let not God speak with us, lest we die. They were scared. Now listen to verse 20. This is an important point, and bring it all the way back to the context of where we are, of what's happening in Mount Sinai, and then these first 10 laws that God gives, and then we go into chapter 21. And Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, and that his fear may be before you, so that you may not sin. Mike, would you do me a favor? Would you read Ecclesiastes 12, verse 13? Can you quote it? Say it out loud. Let us hear the conclusion of the matter. Well, this is, and you can translate, this is man's all. This is why he was made. This is what he's all about. And so, a little healthy fear will help God's people obey commands. Is that a true principle? Ask any parent. A little healthy fear will help in discipline, will help that child have that respect that they should have for that parent. In this case, you see this, you think God could have given them the laws, you know, through rainbows and butterflies and puppies and things like that. You know, he could have, but he didn't. He showed it through lightnings and thunderings and a mountain that's shaking in front of them that they were trembling in their boots. I would have been too. I know I would have. And so they hear these laws and they say, don't you speak to us, don't let God speak to us in case we die. And then Moses explains, that's good, so that you may not sin. All right, so the people stood afar off. And then you close out the chapter before you get into verse 21, an important verse, verse 24. is, let me back up to verse 23. You shall not make anything to be with me, gods of silver or gods of gold, you shall not make for yourselves. So going back to that, don't have any gods before. This is serious business to God. Don't you dare do that. And now, don't forget where they came out of. The Egyptians had a god for everything. Now, there's going to be one God. An altar of earth you shall make for me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen, in every place where I record my name, I will come to you, and I will bless you. He goes on to say, don't you make an altar of stone. You shall not build it with hewn stone. For if you use a tool on it, you have profaned it. The word profane means to pollute, to desecrate, to violate. Think about the symbolism in my mind that's there is who made the earth and the heavens and everything else? God. God wants an altar made of the things that He created, not the things that man created. Don't make a God that will represent me. Don't have a God you're going to bow down to. Don't even have an altar that you made. If you're going to make an altar, you do it on earth. An earthen altar. That's how you meet me. And he goes on in Leviticus chapter 11, verse 44, saying, I am holy. That's the opposite of profane, by the way. And so therefore, this is, again, verse 26, add that to, you shall not go up by the steps to my altar, that your nakedness not be exposed on it. See, sacrifice, when we get into the book of Leviticus, he doesn't really get into that right here. That's more the sacrificial system, the Levitical system, that is all through the book of Leviticus, where blood is required to cover sins. And so it's a covering. You're covering sins. And so whenever you build something to go up, then you're exposing yourself. You're exposing what God is trying to cover up. And so there's symbolism in that as well. This is the context of which we have the Ten Commandments. It's what leads us into the next chapter, which we will pick up next week, of chapter 21. And what chapter 21 does is it starts breaking down these 10 commandments into more minute details or more specific details. Because just like any good old lawyer, what do they like to do? Find the loopholes, right? Well, what do you mean by murder? God's going to answer that question. Very specifically, He's going to give all kinds of scenarios. What do you mean by adultery? Or what do you mean by this? Or what do you mean by that? God's fixing to lay all this out so that it is very clear. And what you are going to see in a synopsis is that God cares about everybody. Everybody. The downtrodden, the lowly of the lowest, and all the way up to the kings. So that's what we'll get into next week when we start chapter 21. I hope this has helped you to get the context of this. And so next week when we look at these more specific laws, it has a little bit more meat to it as we begin to study. Thank you so much for your attention, and have a great rest of your evening.